My name's Peter Frankopan. I'm the director of the Oxford Centre for Byzantine Research, and I'm delighted to be introducing Silvia Ronchey, who I think is on the line too. Yes, yeah, I can see you, in fact, Silvia. Pleasure. Thank you, all of you, for giving up your Sunday afternoon. Congratulations to Petros for organising this event. It's fantastic, these 3 days of having a chance to hear other scholars talk about their work and to gather. I mean, there are so many books being produced in our subject.
I can't hear.
It's a real shortcut to be able to hear authors talk about their own works. It's fantastic. So I hope this carries on in the future. I'm here to chair a session on Hypatia, the True Story by Silvia Ronchey, who doesn't need any introduction. She's one of Italy and Europe's most well-known Byzantine historians, late antiquity and Byzantine studies. She's very famous for her works, particularly on Hypatia, la vera storia, that is in its 6th reprint, which shows how much interest there is both in this figure of Hypatia, but also in our subject as a whole. For housekeeping for everybody, please keep yourself on mute. Questions, please, in the chat box or the Q&A. Sorry, I can't hear Peter. Okay, that's Silvia. That's a problem if we can't hear. We can hear you, Silvia. Okay, let me tell Silvia. Silvia,
Sorry, Peter, I can't hear you.
We can hear you. We can hear you. That's going to be interesting.
What happened?
Hey, Silvia, can you hear us? Silvia?
I suspect maybe it's on volume down.
Yes, I'll type it to her.
Thank you. Let's try that. I think everybody else can hear me. Otherwise, please put in the chat box if you can't.
We can hear you, yeah.
Okay. Silvia, can you hear us?
I think Silvia has to do with the source.
She's not responding.
If you go.
Let's see, okay.
Peter, don't worry about time. I'm happy to give additional minutes at the end of the session because we have a 30 minutes break after 3 book presentations, so okay. We have enough time.
Thank you. Thank you. I wonder if maybe this would drop.
Hello?
Let me check it. Let me check my microphone. So I should go to.
Can you hear us, or she can't hear us? She has to click on the mic, on the arrow next to the mic, to select the speaker.
So settings, I don't know what's happening. Petros, can you speak?
Can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Oh yes, now I can hear you.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay.
So Peter, the floor is yours, and so the session is starting now up until 35. Okay, 36.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Petros. Welcome, Silvia. For a moment, I thought that we were going to have a a disappointing session. I know we're not having read your book. So I have been introducing you, saying how well known you are, and not just in Italy, but all over Europe and all over the world for all of your work, and particularly for your work, in fact, on Hypatia. And I learned from your book that it's in the 6th reprint, which shows just how interested the general public and scholars are in our period, our subject, but also in the figure of Hypatia. So for everybody, I think all your microphones off, you all know what to do. Questions, please, in the chat box in the Q&A. We'll make up time. Thank you, Petros. I'm not going to redo the welcome again, but simply to say how much I've enjoyed reading Silvia's book, which through chance is going to be published, in fact, on my 50th birthday on the 22nd of March. So it was an early birthday present for me to have a chance to read it. But it reads like a murder mystery in places, distinguishing fact from fiction, working through the individual sources to work out the pagan and the Christian views of what actually happened in the early 5th century is one thing. And then Silvia takes us through just how important this story and the figure of Hypatia has been throughout European consciousness. And it's a who's who, really, reading through the people who commented on Hypatia, that I sort of knew how important she was, but seeing everybody from Gibbon to Evelyn Waugh through all of the usual suspects like Malalas and, of course, St. John and Nikiu. So it would be great, Silvia, for you to talk us through your book. I'd like to ask at the end about the structure. It's a very ingenious way you've written the book. But why don't you tell us all, for those who know about Hypatia, those you said at the beginning in the introduction, that's not just for scholars, but also for general public too. Tell us a bit about who Hypatia was and why you've chosen to write about her.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, dear colleagues, friends, strangers, that, well, thank you for being here wherever here is. So let me start by saying that I have been working on Hypatia for over 30 years. An early essay of mine was published in 2001 by the University of Chicago Press, and this was an English translation of an even earlier essay of mine published in Italy in 1994, and was followed by other contributions of mine on Hypatia until in 2010 my monograph on her appeared in Italy and in Italian. It was conceived as a scholarly contribution to the discussion of her fate, and also, as you mentioned, Peter, as a treatment accessible to a learned but not necessarily academic audience. And this might have worked out, considering that the Italian book is in its 6th print. But sadly, Italica no longer leguntur, at least among the larger scholarly audience. So this is one of the reasons why I have decided to produce 10 years later a revised, updated, fully updated, and therefore unavoidably much enlarged English monography, which is the book I am presenting here, which reconstructs Hypatia's life, her intellectual work, and, as you mentioned, her modern Nachleben, through a philological and literary inquiry whose ultimate goal is actually to bring to light the murder, as you said, and the very fact that Hypatia's murder was a political murder, although a rather reckless one, caused, as witnessed in most ancient sources, by a violent burst of irrationality of the Christian bishop of Alexandria, Cyril. The ancient sources use the word phtonos, literally violent envy, or however we should understand its meaning. So, speaking of facts, one more word, rather important, about the book's title, which is Hypatia, the True History. This is a rather provocative, intentionally provocative title, and this relates to the contemporary concept, historiographical concept, of false or fake history. And this is what does the overall methodological treatment of my book. So let me briefly summarize its contents. There are three sections. The first is called Clarifying the Facts. And here I gather, as you mentioned, and compare and philologically analyze all extant evidence on Hypatia's life and death, gleaned from all available ancient sources, both pagan and Christian. Oh, let me add shortly that originally, in my view, must have coexisted two versions of Hypatia's murder, one pagan and one Christian, each available in two variants, one moderate and one radical. So the Pagan Narratives by Hesychius of Miletus and Damascus are both passed down in the Middle Byzantine period by Suidas. Numerous fragments from Photis's library preserve also another interesting source, the version by Philostorges, who, being an Arian Christian, was an opponent of Cyril. And his text was from the beginning of the manuscript tradition appended to Damascus' variant of the pagan version. As to the Christian versions, the more moderate is by Socrates Scholasticus' church history, whose narrative regarding the case, the murder, probably conforms to the point of view of the central Byzantine church. And this is the version eschewed by dominant Western ecclesiastical opinion, though with some doubts sometimes. While the most radical version, on the other hand, you mentioned it, is the Chronicle of John of Nicaea, derived from one or more older, possibly vernacular, versions produced in favor of Cyril of Alexandria within the Coptic Church, lost to the West, and preserved in the Eastern tradition in a late Ethiopian version. The second of the three sections of the book is called Betraying the Facts. And it is devoted, as you were saying, to the afterlife of the figure of Hypatia. And here is the answer to the question who Hypatia was. Well, who knows? Her figure was modernized, mystified, and transformed according to the period and according to its cultural and religious trends, into a secular icon, a romantic heroine, or even a Christian martyr, and so on. Yet perhaps I think that the reception of the figure of Cyril is even more revealing for the history of political thought. If it is true, and frankly it is, that Cyril's ecclesiastical strategy tended to interfere constantly in the jurisdiction of the prefect Orestes and of the central Constantinopolitan government. So this was the very erosion of state power dreaded by the Alexandrian aristocracy, pagan as well as moderate Christian, of which Hypatia was, let's say, the spokesperson. Well, then the conviction or exaltation of Cyril of Alexandria is a litmus test of the position that any historian or literary interpreter assumes with respect to the relations between church and state in every age of history. The third and last section is called Interpreting the Facts, and responds to the more or less conscious distortions that have accumulated, as we have seen, over the centuries. Hypatia was not a secular martyr. She was not a Galileo in a skirt, punished by the church for God knows what scientific discoveries, let alone a proto-feminist. The conflict she found herself involved in wasn't even between paganism and Christianity. It was between fundamentalism and moderation, between dogmatism and open-mindedness. Eternal conflict, and cutting across the very same pagan upper class which was mostly Christianized, especially after the Theodosian decrees. It is also true, however, that Hypatia was a charismatic, a sort of priestly figure, a mentor of consciences, this is certain, and also, and we know that, reading Synesius, an initiator in the esoteric teachings of Platonism. So a woman philosopher, as long as we understand her philosophia as that particular relationship between the female and the sphere of the sacred, of the super-rational, that is typical of late antique spirituality. So, in conclusion, who was Hypatia? Who and what Hypatia was? She is the emblem of the intellectual fervor of, let me quote Denis de Diderot, the eclectic Platonism that dominated 5th century Alexandria, and that continued, as we very well know, after her martyrdom, and was the prerequisite and threshold for a flourishing that would last for the entire Byzantine millennium. Thank you.